everyone. Before I start, I want to give two disclaimers. One is that I am used to speaking in 7-minute video segments. I think this is the longest held thought I've had in a very long time. So thank you for inviting me to talk for 20 minutes without angry YouTube comments or any interruptions. I really appreciate it. The other is that the argument I'm going to make tonight is not an argument that I've made publicly before, and is one that I have a lot of anxiety about as a journalist. So if what I'm going to say is dumb or makes no sense, and you feel that way, part of me agrees with you, and thank you for bearing with me anyway and offering me some grace. So that being said, in October of 1996, Fox News launched and adopted its slogan, fair and balanced. The network was trying to brand itself as an alternative to what they saw as the liberal mainstream media. A few years later, they came up with another slogan, we report, you decide. Bill O'Reilly, God rest his soul, on his own show, came up with the slogan, the no spin zone. And we can look at these slogans now and laugh for obvious reasons. Fox News calling itself fair and balanced is like me calling myself straight and emotionally stable. We all kind of know it's not true. Don't clap for that. But the truth is that as a culture, we take the ideas behind those slogans very seriously. Adolph Ochs, the founding publisher of the modern New York Times, once wrote that a responsible newspaper must, quote, report all sides of a controversial issue and let the reader decide the truth. And while the New York Times and Fox News could not be more different as news organizations, both of these are hinting at the same popular idea, that good journalism is neutral. It's impartial. It doesn't tell you what to think or believe. It presents you with all sides of an issue and lets you figure it out. That idea is deeply rooted in an American anxiety about bias. We have been trained as a culture to view bias in journalism as disqualifying. If a reporter has personal feelings about the story they're covering, especially about politics, we assume that they cannot be trusted to tell the truth accurately. And so our media ecosystem has been built around minimizing bias by trying to present the audience with every possible perspective and letting them choose. If there is a debate about a bill in Congress, quote a member of both parties and let the public figure it out. If 99% of scientists say the Earth is getting hotter and we're all about to die, find one who says it's not so that both sides get a fair shot. If Trump says something insane about Obama wiretapping Trump Tower, have a 9-person panel on to argue about it for a whole hour on CNN's primetime. I don't know if you all watch CNN, but they have 9-person panels. Where are you supposed to look during that argument? There's no talking stick. It's very overwhelming. NYU journalism professor Jay Rosen calls this both sides approach the view from nowhere. In our desire to avoid being accused of bias, journalists have essentially become glorified stenographers, playing referee while activists, politicians, and political pundits fight it out. And maybe you are okay with this. After all, this is a highly American approach to journalism. We don't need some fancy Ivy League, I don't know why I'm doing Foghorn Leghorn right now, but we don't need some fancy East Coast elite telling us who's right and who's wrong. We're Americans, goddammit. Let them fight it out and I will decide. And as a college-educated former debater, I want to think of myself that way too. Just present me with both sides and I will do the work to figure out who's right and who's wrong. The problem is that is absolutely not how our brains work. For one, we tend to mentally check out when we're exposed to argumentative news coverage like this. Most of us are not experts in science or public policy. So when we see two people arguing about something that we don't know a lot about, we tend to assume that both of them are at least a little bit right, that the truth lies somewhere in the middle of what they're saying. A 2011 study from Ohio State University found that when participants read an article about a hypothetical bill that just presented quotes from both parties about that bill, they ended up feeling less confident that they could figure out the truth. We report, you decide, made them less likely to decide at the end of it. And if you've ever watched an interview with Kellyanne Conway, you know exactly what this feels like. You will probably start that interview knowing what is going on, and by the end of it, you'll be a lot less confident that you could describe what the argument was about. Our brains are actually not that efficient at sorting through that much bullshit in a short amount of time. The second problem is the one that stresses me out the most, which is that human brains tend to believe what they hear repeated. Human brains tend to believe, that's a cheap trick, I'm not gonna make that joke again. The more that we're exposed to an idea, the more likely we are to remember it as true, even if we've never actually seen proof that that idea is correct. If every time you turned on CNN, you watched a segment about whether Carlos Maza runs an underground fight club, after a while, a part of you would start to think, maybe he does, because your brain would associate Carlos Maza with underground fight club. And you would think that that was more likely even if you had no reason to believe that that was possibly true. Similarly, if you turned on CNN and watched 100 segments about whether vaccines cause autism, your brain would start to link the idea of vaccine with autism. And me using that example in this speech makes you slightly more likely to make that error. And what's scary is that happens even when the false idea is being debunked. A bunch of studies have been done about this, but people tried to see if fact-checking would make you less likely to remember the lie, and it didn't. Because fact-checking requires first establishing what you're trying to debunk, and doing that reinforced the idea in your head. If CNN was constantly saying, Carlos does not run an underground fighting ring, you would still associate Carlos Maza with fighting ring. And I use that example as a joke, but it's actually really scary in real life. There was this recent report that found that many content moderators at Facebook, people whose whole job it is to find conspiracy theories and take them down, started to believe those conspiracy theories over time. These people were trained to recognize and debunk bullshit, and even they could not resist the persuasive effects of repetition. That alone should make us skeptical of this both sides approach to journalism. But the bigger problem is how easily that approach can get hijacked by bad actors, demagogues, con artists, and conspiracy theorists who realize correctly that all they have to do to sell a lie to the public is to get journalists to talk about it. The most obvious example of this has been the debate over climate change. Fossil fuel companies and Republicans have spent years convincing journalists that the debate about climate change is just another political football with two sides, that climate scientists are actually just left-wing activists, and that not including climate deniers in these debates is a form of bias. That sounds ridiculous to us here in this pretty progressive college, but that strategy has actually been incredibly effective at shaping the way that we talk about climate change in this country. News networks have been very influenced by the idea that not having two sides is a form of bias. And so it is almost impossible to find a major news network debating the dangers of climate change without including a climate denier on that panel. These climate deniers know that they cannot actually win the debate about climate change. Most of them are not even climate scientists. They're political pundits or former weathermen or people with direct ties to fossil fuel companies. But winning the debate is not the point. The point is to make the issue seem messy, to make the debate so frustrating that people stop paying attention and start defaulting to whatever their political party tells them they should believe about an issue. Nobody embodies that strategy better than Donald Trump. And I'll be honest, I don't really want to talk about Trump tonight. You all seem like nice people, and I'm exhausted, so I'll try to make this quick. But Donald Trump's presidency is and I have this written down, a nightmare carnival of bullshit. He lies early, he lies often, he lies about big things and small things. Most of them are not even good lies. The wiretapping thing, the voter fraud thing. He knows what he's doing, we know what he's doing, we're used to it by now. If somebody behaved like this in normal life, we would stop taking what they said seriously. If every time we talked, I said, I can bench press 1,000 pounds and I'm secretly dating Jake Gyllenhaal, you wouldn't seriously ask me how I got that jacked or what it's like dating a celebrity. You wouldn't even ask me to prove it. You would just say, he's full of it, ignore what he says, hey everyone, this guy lies. But Trump and his surrogates have been relentless about accusing news outlets of being biased against him. And so we've seen major news networks go out of their way to appear fair and balanced, even in the face of stuff that we know is not true. CNN has hired an army of Trump supporters to defend Trump on their nightly news panels, filling the airways with enough nonsense and doublespeak to make anyone's eyes roll back. No joke, one of those people was Trump's former campaign manager who had a non-disclosure agreement with Trump while he was on CNN. That guy got paid by CNN. Outlets like NPR twist themselves into knots to avoid using the word lie to describe what Trump says. News networks still invite Kellyanne Conway and Sarah Sanders on national TV, knowing full well that they are going to lie to their audience and won't stop lying even when faced with the facts. When Trump calls something fake news, I said I was going to stop talking about him and I have all this stuff about him. When Trump calls something fake news, he knows he's wrong. But that isn't the point. The point is to spook the referees, to make news networks so afraid of being accused of bias that they agree to give bullshit a serious hearing. Look at which news networks Trump goes after with this fake news stuff. It's not MSNBC. It's CNN, the network that's afraid of being described as being too liberal. He picks on them because he knows that their fear of bias makes them vulnerable to bad faith acts. That is the easy part of my speech. It is actually kind of easy to argue that journalism should be about the facts and that neutrality makes it hard to understand the facts. The truth is, though, that journalism is not just about the facts. It's also about morality. Journalism is also about justice. It's about how and what we as a society consider worthy of public consideration and public debate. When was the last time you turned on your TV and saw a serious discussion about whether interracial marriage was right or wrong? When was the last time you opened a newspaper and saw a real debate about whether gay people should be put in prison for having sex? It's not like there's no controversy about those issues. About 20% of Americans still think interracial marriage is wrong. A shocking number of states still have unconstitutional sodomy laws on the books. We don't see these debates anymore because at some point, news networks decided it was immoral to argue about this anymore. That even treating these things as worthy of consideration violates some core good principle of journalism. That decision was the right one, but it has nothing to do with facts. It has to do with bias. It has to do with a newsroom's own judgments about right and wrong, good and evil. And journalists have to make calls like that all the time. If you're covering a story about a Christian baker who refused to serve a gay couple, is your story about the baker's religious beliefs or the couple's humiliation? If you're writing about a victim of police brutality, do you use a picture of the victim's mugshot or their high school yearbook photo? If you're writing about a campus sexual assault case, is your last paragraph about the victim's trauma or the accused's reputation? There is no fact-based way to answer those questions. How you answer them is defined by your values, your experiences, and your biases. But you can't avoid answering those questions either. In 2009, NPR's ombudsman defended the outlet's decision to not use the word torture to describe acts like waterboarding. She said, quote, "The word torture is loaded with political and social implications. NPR's job is to give listeners all perspectives, present the news as detailed as possible, and put it in context." This January, NBC sent a memo to its reporters urging them to not use the word racist to describe Iowa Representative Steve King's white supremacist comments, writing, quote, "Be careful to avoid characterizing King's remarks as racist. It is okay to attribute to others, as in what many are calling racist, or something like that." You can call these decisions a lot of things. What you cannot call them is neutral. Refusing to name evil and bigotry for what it is not a neutral act. Treating homophobia, xenophobia, and racism as just one side in a legitimate debate is not a neutral act. It actively aids those who want to make evil and bigotry seem normal and acceptable. It signals to your audience that reasonable people can disagree about this, and by extension, that bigotry is a reasonable position. Journalists are gatekeepers. We help decide what is or is not worthy of public debate. And no matter how objective your lens is, no matter how clear your view of the world is, you still have to decide where you want to point your camera. Making that decision means answering big, messy questions about power and morality, about what matters and what doesn't, and about what kind of society we should be trying to live in. It also means taking responsibility for those answers, admitting that your newsroom has a point of view, and being willing to defend it. And that is really scary. It makes sense that we'd be worried about things like bias and subjectivity. Nobody wants to become their own version of Fox News. But it's worth remembering that neutrality in the face of bullshit and bigotry is its own kind of bias. It's a decision to give up on trying to make sense of the world, and it's a decision that leaves people at home to fend for themselves at a time when demagogues and hate mongers are most eager to fill the void we leave behind. Thanks, guys.
Good evening. Working okay? Here we go. Well, good evening, everybody. Again, my name's Chris Davids. I am a professor here at Westminster and work in the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we're going to spend some time here with an opportunity for questions with Carlos. And so again, I just want to encourage everybody to think about questions that you're curious to ask. Sophia and I are currently chatting on our devices, sharing the questions that you have. And so you can go to the website that is listed there and on your device, and you're welcome to submit questions that I'll use. So to start, Carlos, I'd like to ask you just to share a little bit more about your background and your entry into journalism. How is it that you got to where you are?
So I did not have, is this on? Can you hear me? Cool. So I did not have a traditional background. I didn't go to J school. I went to undergrad for debate, basically, but I was a political science major and a women's studies minor, only because they didn't offer women's studies as a major, so I was like, fine. And then I thought that I was going to be a think tank writer, writing about nuclear weapons policy, and then I didn't get any of those internships. And then I got an internship writing about LGBT policy at a think tank and thought, yeah, this is it. And then I worked really hard on this policy brief for like weeks and published it, and I think 7 people read it, and I was like, never mind, I'm not doing this. So this job opened up at a media watchdog that I ended up working at, and they were opening up an LGBT department, and basically the only qualifications for that job were know how to write and be gay, and I was like, at least 1.5 of those things I can do. So I did that for 5 years. I was the program director there, and then after 5 years, I just got tired of finding like creative ways to say, stop being a bigot, and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore, and I got tired of writing. So I went to my boss and said, probably going to quit, but I could also do this on-camera stuff and talk about other issues. I think I can do it. Can you just trust me? And he did. So I got my video series at my old job. The videos are still on the internet. They are really, really bad. Please do not look for them. They are really, really bad. I was so afraid. And then after 6 months, I had a friend who worked at Vox, and I asked her to meet with me and basically said, I think I could do this for Vox. We're already stealing all of your music and like your title cards. Like we're basically making Vox videos, just hire us. And we went back and forth for like 6 months. It was like a really long time of convincing them that I could make good videos and that I knew what I was doing. And it was during the election. So we were all operating under the idea that like Hillary was gonna win. And so I was like pitching all these videos that I never made, like really, really boring videos like Democrats are too bullish on nuclear energy. Just like boring, bad video ideas. And then the election happened, and I sent Vox an email that was like, never mind all that other stuff. The world's on fire, I want to make videos about this. And I think it like lit a fire under their butts too, and so they hired me, and then I spent like a month trying to figure out what I was going to name the series. I had some really bad name ideas. And then you can watch like my first videos on Vox. I still didn't really know what the show was, and I still don't really know what the show is. But I was like sitting at a desk, I had a plant. It was like very trying to imitate cable news, and then I just kept doing it. But yeah, I have no journalism background, which is a source of major insecurity, but also I know a lot of people who went to J school who are like so bad at their jobs. So I think maybe at least I saved money.
That first video you did, that was way back when Sean Spicer was around. Remember that?
Yeah, it was right after that inauguration thing, and I was so naive. I was like, if he can't be trusted about this, how can he be trusted about anything? And I'm looking back at it, I'm like, he can't. Like, what is wrong with you? But it was a different time. I was very naive.
So Carlos, I'm wondering if you can talk with us a little bit more about some of your own social identities that you have. And so I know President Dobkin had mentioned a few. There may be others that you think about that feel salient for you in your work. What of your identities feel like they play into the content that you create, the work that you do at Vox?
So I grew up in Miami as a relatively fair-skinned Cuban kid. So for most of my life, I was like, I'm white. Like I never experienced like outsider status growing up in Miami. And then I went to school in North Carolina, and I was like, oh, never mind, not white. But it wasn't genuinely, it was not this thing about like assimilation for immigrant communities. It was like never a thing in my brain. I grew up at a school where everyone was Cuban. We would like bully the Irish kids. It was like a very topsy-turvy world. But it didn't inform my like perspective of the world. What did inform my perspective a lot was coming out, and when I came out, I got introduced to like a bunch of like third wave punk, queer, feminist music and theory, and was like, this is my life now. It was like bad punk feminist music and Rage Against the Machine, and I was like, I'm a human, this is me now, this is my whole identity. And then going to college and taking gender studies courses, it was like partially women's studies and also partially queer theory, and that stuff influenced me a lot. Doing LGBT activism work after I graduated influenced me a lot, because like, you'll be surprised how awful people can be. Like, you gotta really learn that stuff up close and like go to anti-gay conferences and hear them talking about you and be like, yeah, there's no bottom. Like, people will be as awful as you can possibly imagine, and they'll do it to your face. And that trained me to like be able to tolerate hearing a lot of really awful stuff, and I still take it personally, but like not being wrecked by it, not feeling the need to respond really emotionally, and just like kind of keeping my wits about me. And also realizing that like there are some fights that are worth fighting and some that are not. So like if you're having an argument about whether gay people are people, or like whether gay people are pedophiles, those arguments aren't worth engaging in. You can't win those debates, because even engaging in them cedes the ground to your opponent. And that's been a really helpful lesson. A lot of that was debate too, like learning when it's a lost cause to make an argument, what you can dismiss. But being queer and doing like queer activism taught me a lot about like, you can't always respond to every bullshit thing. Like, it's too draining, and also it's not persuasive. You have to just make a compelling counter argument that the world should be different. If I spent all my time during that work like re-explaining that gay people are not pedophiles, I would have not been productive. I had to instead make the affirmative argument, which is like, we're humans, and you miss out if you don't invite us to your party, so like stop being awful. And that's a really important lesson to learn. I do that a lot in my work, about like having to decide what dumb thing should I respond to and what dumb thing is not worth it. And that comes from being a marginalized group and having to like develop smart strategies and survival tactics for navigating what is often like an avalanche of bigotry and bullshit. I'm gay first, I think. I'm more shaped by being gay than anything else.
So we have a couple of questions that stem from what you were just sharing there. And so we have somebody in the audience who had asked, what is something surprising you've learned or saw from going undercover at some of those LGBTQ or right-wing events?
Great question. Okay, so I went to this, I believe it or not, I pretended to be straight for like a whole weekend once. And I went to this conference in San Diego that was like a Protect Marriage conference, and it was like for all these college students. So I was also pretending to be a college student. I had to pack clothes that I thought read as straight. So I like packed these big khakis that didn't fit on me, but they were from Bonobos, so the inside lining was plaid, and everyone was like, "You're fancy." I was like, "I'm just gay." So I went to that conference, and I had been like tracking these people from afar, and I just assumed that they were all going to be monsters, and a lot of them were monsters. But I was also hanging out with like BYU kids who were going there for college credit, and who were so nice and like did not know any better. And I was there for 4 days, so at the end of the 4 days, I was like, I like you guys. Like, can we be Facebook friends? And then they were my Facebook friends, and then they were like, oh, what? They should have known. There was this moment where we were all in the car together driving to this like theme park on the water in San Diego, and Backstreet Boys came on, and I knew every single word, and I was like, how have you not clocked me right now? Like, is this a trap? Anyway, to answer your question, what surprised me is that like most of them, the people at the top were bigots and were like vile people. Most of them had like no idea why what they were learning was awful, and were actually very open to the idea that they could be wrong and like be deprogrammed. They did it in weird ways. Like I read a report about that, and the kids saw it, like the kids who I was friends with. And after that, they sent me all these nice Facebook messages that were like, well-meaning nice. They were like, I would have been cool with it. Again, with the country accents that I don't know how to do. I was like, I would have been cool with it. I have a lot of metrosexual friends. And I was like, oh my, I don't know how to, okay, thank you so much. But like, they weren't bad people, and a lot of them, if you experience a lot of like the worst of bigotry, you just assume that everyone who must believe this is a monster. And it's humbling to learn, A, that the banality of evil, that like good people can say really evil things without realizing it, and B, that fact does not undermine the need to challenge those people and like to be really aggressive. That the fact that good people do awful things does not mean that those things are not still awful and that you should treat them as awful things. So I didn't know that as like some East Coast elite who just assumed that everyone who lived west of me was like a total monster, when they're just like, they're kids who listen to Backstreet Boys just like you, or just like me.
Thank you for bringing up metrosexual. I hadn't thought about that since high school. I think I have to go dig for my guide to being metrosexual that I had before I came out.
I know, even when she said it, it was like kind of a while after people would use that word, and I was like, offensive, but in a nice way? Like by accident?
So another question about going undercover. So we have a question. So you're going undercover in the National Organization for Marriage Conference sounds emotionally harrowing, but it is still impressively written. How did you balance professionalism with an experience so extreme like that?
Thanks. Yeah, so actually the first draft of that piece had like, weirdly enough, given the speech I just gave, had zero voice. Like I didn't use the word I once. I didn't mention anything about how I felt. I was like, I went to this thing, here's what happened day one, here's what happened day two, here's an audio clip, like very, very cerebral. And my straight editor was like, dude, this is so boring. Why are you not talking about your experience as a person writing it? So I had to rewrite it, and the piece I ended up writing was like, I mean, for me at that point was like kind of vulnerable. It was about what I expected and also how it felt to be in a room hearing someone make like the gay people are pedophiles joke and be, or not joke, it was like a real argument, and be like, God, that's like about me. Like these people are talking about me right now. So I wrote about it that way, and I mean, it takes more out of you as a writer, because anytime you write from a personal viewpoint like that, you're admitting to vulnerability, and like you're admitting also in that piece like feelings of shame and like feelings of self-doubt and feelings of fear, like genuine fear at that thing. And that's scary because when you include your personal opinions, you open yourself up to being accused of like being, a hack or like a partisan or just being overly emotional. Like we had this idea that people who have emotions are suddenly no longer objective or can't tell a correct story. And so that stuff was really tough. And the reason I wrote it so dry at first is because I wanted people to believe me and be like, look at the shit that I saw. Like this happened. But what ended up happening is that the version of it that was more personal, I think made it more palatable for people to read. And I think for the kids who were at that conference who read it afterward, made it more effective in changing their mind. Because they could have seen me after that as like this like, again, like this coastal elite operative who just got like dropped in to screw over their lives and like expose them. And once they saw that, it was like, no, I'm actually also just kind of a kid who is really afraid of you people, and like, please stop being mean to me. It softened them a lot. And I think if you were on the fence and read that piece, it introduces an important piece of evidence, which is this shit affects people and like hurts the people who hear it, even journalists who are supposed to be like, tight asses about it. And that is evidence. We don't think of it as like evidence in a typical journalistic sense, but that anecdote, that reality is important and is a real thing that happened. And so it ended up enriching my reporting a lot when I thought that if I wrote about it personally, my straight editor would be like, what's all this flowery stuff? And he was like, no, that's the stuff. That's the story, it's not flowery.
So what type of reactions do you get to your use of self in journalism?
The most common one is people just calling me a liberal hack, or like calling me any version of that, and just saying that I'm biased and that Vox is biased, and you're only saying that because you're a liberal, which like doohickey, like doohickey, yes. It's always bonkers to me. I started trying to write around that argument. It's never been my intention to hide that I'm like a progressive, and so I've started to write jokes into my scripts of like, I'm an Antifa super soldier, I'm a hippie dippy, I drink soy milk all the time. Not because I think it'll stop the attacks. If anything, it aggravates them and makes them worse. But because what's frustrating is that if you try to play yourself off as like a straight edge journalist and someone detects and smells your bias, they think that calling you on your bias ends the discussion. Like I said, the assumption is that if they find that bias on you, then it's over and nothing you say matters. And my hope and like my strategy is that by incorporating that as like part of the argument and being like, yo, as a biased person, here's what I think, prove my argument wrong, that it kind of takes that off the table, that I accept your worst critique of me, which is that I'm a liberal hack, and challenge you
to debate my argument on the merit either way. And if it's true that my liberal hackness makes me a bad journalist and makes what I'm saying faulty, you should be able to beat the argument I'm making, but I don't want to keep arguing about whether or not I'm a liberal hack. Absolutely I am. I am informed by my perspective. And so I've tried to make that as like almost like a secondary thesis of every Strike video I make is like, by the way, I'm saying this as a hippie who does not eat any meat. And so, duh, we don't have to argue about that anymore. Prove this hippie wrong. That's not a good way of putting it, but like, what is your argument after that? What's number two of that approach? Because the implication with accusing a journalist of bias is that something in their fact-finding is then faulty, that they've skipped some step in their ability to describe the world. And if you do step one for them and say, cool, what else you got? It hopefully disarms them a tiny bit. I get other comments that are less about my bias and more about like my femininity or my campiness or whatever, which is less interesting to me just because, again, doohickey, and also it has like nothing to do with the argument I'm making. So yeah, I am feminine and campy, but like I made an argument about how news outlets cover the Green New Deal, so like what are you talking about? And also a lot of that stuff is just like, you have to realize that the people on YouTube who are commenting are like 15-year-old boys who play too much Counter-Strike. Nope, it's too late for that. Overwatch, whatever the new game is. And so like, you have to realize that, yeah, if you're talking to an audience that is made up of kids, you're gonna get kid responses back, and like, it's actually not on me to fix that for them. And also, if you're the kind of person who thinks that femininity or queerness makes somebody non-credible, there's nothing I can do about that. I like can't push it up for you, and also I have other stuff to worry about, and so that stuff bothers me a lot less than like the bias thing, because I'm like, get over it, what else you got? And that part can be really frustrating. Am I talking not consistently into the mic and it's getting really annoying? It is? Cool, thanks for agreeing. I'll try to be better.
So how are your editorial judgments influenced by your identities?
So this whole thesis basically that I just presented is like a long-term result of the experience that I had growing up and watching in Florida local news debates about whether gay marriage should be legal, and prior to that, whether gay adoption should be legal. I remember watching those debates on TV with my mom before I was out and being like, this profoundly sucks and I hate this. And also having, not the language, but the inclination in my head that like, maybe these people shouldn't be allowed to talk. Like watching like the Florida Family Policy Council and being like, I don't know if anyone's getting anything good out of this. Maybe we should stop. So as like a 13-year-old closeted kid, I was like, both sides is bad. But the more intellectual version of that is like, if you're debating about your identity, especially about identity stuff, it just becomes so much more obvious that presenting both sides is like not meaningfully important. Like not just about gay stuff, but like watching debates about immigration or about trans people, often it's like including the con side does not meaningfully enhance anyone's understanding of the issue. It's mainly just like, how awful can this person be? And so it was kind of this, I mean, it was kind of like growing up queer and going to religion class and being like, something about this feels off. Suddenly I'm skeptical about the whole thing. Like becoming radicalized as an atheist, becoming radicalized as a journalist was seeing that experience of having both sides debate whether gay people are people and being like, this sucks. This platform sucks and I don't like it anymore. And if this sucks, I bet it sucks in a lot of other contexts. And then growing up and reading a bunch of like journalistic studies about how, yeah, actually debating climate change makes people dumb about climate change. Debating voter fraud makes people dumb about voter fraud. It's all the same thing, which is just like presenting somebody with a bad opinion does not make them more informed about beating the bad opinion. More often it makes them more likely to believe the bad opinion. I don't know if I would have come to that conclusion if I was like a straight white guy. Genuinely, I think I probably would still have like a lot of faith in objectivity and balance and neutrality as a journalistic method. But once you're on the losing side of that equation, it's like hard to go back. I'm like, I think this might always be bad as like a general practice. And so that radicalized me. It wasn't about a debate about immigration, though. I'm sure if I was like living in another state, it would have been about that. It was like watching people say, gay people can't be trusted around kids, and seeing my mom nod along and be like, boy, I wish this segment wasn't happening right now. I'd like to make this never happen again, and becoming radicalized in that way. My poor mom must be like, I'm a good mom. Like she wasn't a monster, but I had anxieties that she might become one because she was watching monsters on TV.
So we have a question here that reads, so 2 days ago, James Dow of the New York Times spoke on the clear separation in his company between the news and opinion departments. Uh-oh. Zoom in on that look.
I'm aware.
During a time of so much demagoguery, where the exclusion of even the most fringe views brings accusations of bias, is this clear separation of news and opinion still feasible?
No, and it's also never been feasible. Anyone who thinks that there's a divide between opinion and news is lying. News is opinion. Every news article is informed by the biases of the author. What you think is important, what evidence you think is credible, what the headline should be, what picture you use for your headline, all of those things are informed by the biases of the author, the judgment of the author, which is informed by their experiences, what they've gone through, their values, who their teachers were. It's all a reflection of the self. There is no such thing as a blank slate. That person never existed. We thought it existed because newsrooms were dominated by people who all looked the same, and so they all kind of sounded the same, and so it kind of felt like they were speaking the capital T truth. But the truth was just that they had one perspective that they were all abiding by. And the minute you introduce black journalists or queer journalists, suddenly you're aware that this capital T truth feels like a lot more fraught. The reason we have that divide is because in a lot of papers, and especially in the New York Times, the opinion section is like an excuse to make arguments without evidence. Like if you read New York Times op-eds, a lot of them are just like dudes having feelings. Like they just people's opinions about things. And we can have a debate about whether or not that's an important role for news outlets to be engaging in, like just publishing commentary, another Barry Weiss column that we all have to read. But the fact that that stuff is low evidence does not mean that stuff that's high evidence is suddenly devoid of opinion. And like the New York Times has to make it their judgment call about what they're gonna cover, what's important, who do we interview for this stuff, who do we exclude from our piece. And those decisions are all made by people who have biases and judgments and opinions about what is actually important. If I ask everyone in this room to write me an article about what is happening right now, I would get back 100 different articles, because some of you would focus on how I was dressed, and some of you would focus on how Chris is dressed, and some of you would focus on how I'm using the mic, and all of those things are factual reports. The difference is not about facts, it's about your perspective and bias as an author, and that's okay. There's nothing that you could write that would be totally devoid of feeling and emotion, but this idea that we can actually separate those two things, and that the news section is a part of the newspaper that is the capital T truth that accesses some like higher objective out there reality, is almost always an excuse to hide bias and disguise it as objectivity. It's not. It would be much better if, as news outlets, we said, we have a point of view, here's what it is. If you don't like it, you don't have to read our newspaper. Here's why we think that point of view is correct. And based on that point of view, here's what we think matters in the world. Here's what we think is a legitimate debate, and here's what's not. And if you did that, and Trump said, you're fake news, you don't like me, and the New York Times was like, yeah, we don't, because you don't tell the truth and you don't care about marginalized groups, and we think that's important in a liberal democracy, that'd be a very different debate. He would still say fake news, but an audience would have a chance to think, okay, but then what? Then what? If everyone has an opinion, who do I want to listen to, and why? And what does it say about me as a reader? So, that New York Times guy is really smart and has been doing this for a long time, and I recognize that I'm like a snot-nosed kid who didn't go to J school, but there's a part of me that's like, people who think that way about journalism and they think that it can be a blank slate are often from a background that like did not experience how much it sucks to not be writing from the blank slate and to be on the receiving end of like what someone thinks is capital T truth. I'm sure he's a nice guy. I'm just tired of reading Barry Weiss columns, and so I have a sore feeling about the New York Times op-ed page.
Well, Carlos, as you're talking, I have a lot swirling in my head of thinking about the paradigm of journalism and the ways where structurally, especially working from this place of objectivity and neutrality, that it's going to inherently reinforce systems of power. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, do you feel that journalism has a role in either being a gatekeeper for what you might call bullshit that is systematically reinforcing that power? Do you believe that journalism is a place to work towards social justice?
Yeah, and even if you don't agree with me, in your gut, I'm right. Because if you look at the types of journalism that we venerate in pop culture, the kind of stuff that we make movies about, it's not about journalists who are fair and balanced. It's almost always about journalists who are like exposing abuse and corruption, taking down some big institution that has a ton of power and speaking up on behalf of those who don't have power. That's a good ideal. And if you talk to anyone who's like super into the First Amendment, they have this idea that like the reason we need a free press is because it's our best defense against corruption and abuse and the misuse of power. That's fine, but if you believe that, you also have to make a judgment about who has power and what abuse is and who victims are, and those are editorial calls. They're really important editorial calls, but that is a central function of journalism. I don't want newspapers to just be like really good record keepers of how our democracy died. I want them at their best to be like an effective advocate for liberal democracy, that there are certain ideas that we in America think are important, and we think that journalism is a really powerful tool to maintain and protect those ideas. The whole idea that journalists are meant to challenge politicians who are corrupt is based on this other idea that there shouldn't be corruption in a democracy, and that people without power should still be treated equally and have dignity and shouldn't be taken advantage of or scapegoated. Those are good ideals, but we have to kind of own that for that to work, news outlets have to be trusted and encouraged to like be kind of fearless and relentless and editorial about what they cover. In terms of whether or not news outlets should be gatekeepers, they should, and that has historically been their function. That's why we have editors. That's why someone gets to decide what's on the front page. But if you want to know what the world looks like when there are no gatekeepers, and what news would look like if there are no gatekeepers, open up your Facebook feed and see all the crazy shit that is on your news feed. That is a newspaper with no editors. That's a news environment with no gatekeepers. Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and everything that runs on these algorithms are platforms that are meant to aggregate and prioritize what human beings want. And what we want, left to our best devices, is like garbage. It's sugar. We want stuff that's inflammatory, conspiracy theories, stuff that makes us feel angry, stuff that makes us feel tribal, stuff that makes us think of ourselves as an us and a them. If we're left to our own devices, we will gravitate towards that stuff, which is why if you look at all the top posts on YouTube after a mass shooting, it's all conspiracy theories. That stuff always does well. Editors exist and newspapers exist to be like, we know that you want that, but that stuff is bad for you. Here's what actually matters. Facebook doesn't have those guardrails anymore, which is why Facebook moderators, people who are in charge of trying to implicate those or institute those guardrails, are like all losing their minds because they're seeing how dangerous the system can get when it goes out of control. So I'm sympathetic to like the super free speech argument that we should democratize all information and have no gatekeepers and like everyone should be able to post whatever they want. But we kind of already know how that works, and it doesn't. Everyone who uses Facebook or YouTube or Instagram for long enough time becomes a flat earther, becomes an anti-vaxxer, becomes a white supremacist. It's just like a matter of time. You can regulate your own newsfeed, but left to their own devices, especially if you look at how kids use these platforms, they all lose their minds because you need guardrails. You need adults who can be like, I know you want sugar, Jimmy. That's bad for you. Here's what you should eat instead. And it's really bonkers to me that after living through the Facebook era for as long as we have, we still have this idea that like the answer to everything is just more speech. The answer to everything is like an adult saying, cut that shit out. Stop posting flat earther stuff on Facebook.
So what's the limit for what's too much in terms of advocacy or activism in journalism?
I mean, I like to think of it as, I like to think of objectivity as a means to an end. So being objective is not a goal. Being objective is a way of doing work. And so good journalism is stuff that can have a point of view, have something that you're advocating, and argue for that point of view convincingly using evidence that you can assess with a clear head. Looking at research and data, being honest about what the best argument against your position is and trying to seriously engage it. And if it turns out that you can't beat the best argument against you, admitting it and changing your mind. When this goes too far, when advocacy journalism goes too far, it's like what Fox News does, which is like advocacy divorced from any journalistic practice. It's just an opinion for the sake of having an opinion. And that stuff is bad, but people who are really anxious about advocacy journalism, like how little faith do you have in journalists as a class and as a type of art that we practice? Like ostensibly the reason that we're hired is because we use good judgment and we know the difference between what's real and what's bullshit, and some of us go to J school to learn about this stuff, but some of us are just like smart human beings who can like know when a Facebook post is not credible or is credible. And so journalism, advocacy journalism, if it goes awry, it's because it loses the journalism part, which is like an emphasis on fact-finding, being transparent about how you go about finding information, and about genuinely trying to find the best sources and making a correct judgment call about when you've done enough research. You won't always get that right. I often get stuff wrong in my work, and the night before I publish any video, I'm like, I have blown this. This is going to be a disaster. I must have missed something. So that anxiety is always there. But we're like, we're like trained professionals. Ostensibly, we're kind of good at this thing, and ostensibly, the public relies on us to be good at this one thing, which is like finding good information. The thing that differentiates a journalist between a layperson is that we have time and money and a boss being like, go figure it out. And so advocacy journalism goes awry when you stop trying to figure it out. But I thought about using this line in my speech, but I thought it might be too flowery. But like, a desire to see the world as it is is not mutually exclusive with an ability to see the world. Nope, I blew it. That's why I didn't include it in the speech. A desire to see the world as it should be is not mutually exclusive with the ability to see the world as it is. Like, wanting a better world does not mean that you are incapable of seeing things as they are right now. Actually, that's a part of wanting a better world, is being able to identify what is wrong right now. And so a good journalist can do both those things. Advocate for how the world should be, and also explain concretely what's gone awry, what's wrong, what has to change, and what should you, as like educated voters, do to make things better. Am I going too long? Am I waxing poetic? I'm a former college debater, so my impulse is like, unless I hear a timer going off, I'm like, I've got more room to flex. So I'm trying to like keep it short, but yeah, just like count me down every once in a while.
So a couple more questions from people in the audience. I want to go back to some of the discussion we're having around social media. We have a question that says, since social media giants are essentially killing off the news industry, how can we instill more of this editorial morality in the Facebooks of the world?
That's a great question. My honest answer, if you asked me at a bar, would be like, it's too late and we're doomed. My genuine answer is that it's going to be really difficult. The big problem is that companies like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter do not see themselves as publishers. They see themselves as tech platforms. And so if you watch any of like the congressional hearings where these people get dragged in front of Congress to be like, why is this crazy shit on your platform? They say, we're not responsible for what happens. We just created a tool that people are using, and we don't own anything that gets published, and so we have no responsibility for what gets published. That argument is bullshit. Like, Facebook is absolutely a publisher. They have created the public sphere that you're posting on. And if people are using your platform to publish insanity, you are at least somewhat responsible for that insanity. If you put up a bulletin board in front of your house and people started putting Nazi propaganda on that bulletin board and you didn't take it down, you're kind of publishing Nazi propaganda, dude. Like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. That's a big ideological divide, though. It requires convincing Zuckerberg and Dorsey that they're running publishing platforms, and they don't want to admit that they do, because the truth is that admitting that you're running a publishing platform means that you have to answer these really messy questions, like, who is a legitimate publisher? Who is allowed to speak on your platform? One of the frustrating things about watching Twitter is that when they launched, they were like, they branded themselves as these free speech absolutists, this like paradise of open speech. And it was happening during the Arab Spring, so we actually had like these kind of cool examples of people using Twitter, to like organize and mobilize, and it was great. And then a bunch of Nazis showed up on the platform. So people were like, yo, what is this platform about? Like, what are you trying to do? And anytime you ask Jack Dorsey that question, if you like read Twitter's publishing manuals and like their mission statements, their answer is always some airy bullshit like, the goal of Twitter is to have a conversation. And it's like, a conversation about what? And for what end? It's like, we leave that up to the viewers. And it's like, okay. So like, it's climate denialism, that's a conversation. Should we be having that? And Jack Dorsey's like, we leave it up to the viewers. And there was this really scary Twitter ad that went a while back that was called like, it was like Twitter Say Anything or something, and where they were showing all these different people at like coffee shops and bodegas tweeting shit at each other, like disagreeing with each other. And there was this segment in that ad that Twitter paid for that showed some white dude in a vest on a golf course tweeting about how it was still hot, so I guess thank God for global warming, or like something about like glaciers thank God the glaciers melted. In their ad, they're like encouraging you to be kind of an idiot about global warming. And that's the problem with any of these platforms, is that if your mission statement is just let everybody talk, you're inviting the worst people on the planet to talk. And that's what's happened on every platform. Like Nazis run every platform now because what Nazis get on Twitter and Instagram, like I hate talking about Nazis. I'm like so burnt out by our era. But what they get from these platforms that they don't get without them is access to a ton of people. The reason Nazis love Instagram and hate the New York Times is because if you went to the New York Times and tried to publish some white supremacist bullshit, they'd be like, no, dude, not here. You can't use our platform. We have editorial laws. Twitter does not. And so every bad actor benefits from using these platforms. And the truth is that these people have always existed. Like there have always been Nazis, there have always been white supremacists. It's like a part of living in an organized society. But they've been regulated to the fringes because these people cannot on their own amass the tech platform to reach a huge audience. If they did, they could find a bunch of converts. Like there's all this research done about how when reporters started reporting on the Klan in the South, Klan membership spiked because suddenly all these people were hearing about the Klan. That's like a really scary thing about reporting on extremism is like you have to decide how much of a platform you want to give these people, knowing that the more people you tell about them, the more recruits they'll get. The safeguard has been that like we don't publish these people in the Times. We don't give them huge, stumps to speak off of in the public square. Twitter does give them that platform. YouTube gives them that platform. And if you give someone that platform, they're going to use it and they're going to find a ton of recruits. Just hearing people on YouTube say over and over again, immigrants are replacing white people, will find you a bunch of people who are disaffected or alienated, who suddenly start to sound like white supremacists. The only safeguard we have is not arguing with them. You don't want to argue about whether or not immigrants are replacing white people. It's an insane argument. You want to deny them the right to speak, to kick them out of the public square. And we were doing a pretty good job of that for a long time. And then Twitter showed up and Facebook showed up, and suddenly these people had, at an extremely low cost, multi-million, extremely expensive tech platforms at their disposal. And you see what's happening with them now. There's like not a really good way to fight that.
So another question from the audience that we have is, so at this point, are there any media platforms that you find trustworthy?
Okay, no. And what's crazy is, if you asked me a year ago, I would have been like, Pinterest, because Pinterest is happy and there's nothing bad happening on there. Pinterest, if you've been on lately, is controlled by neo-Nazis. It's so weird. People are like pinning anti-vaxxer and white supremacist stuff and like QAnon stuff on Pinterest for the same reason they hit every other platform. There are some people who can get it under control. There are some Reddit boards where the moderators have been super aggressive about cracking down on hate speech and misinformation, and it actually has worked in certain Reddit boards. Like moderation works. Germany has really strong laws against publishing hate speech and like really aggressive fines, and so YouTube in Germany has to have a very different moderation process and like be way more aggro about taking stuff down because they will be sued like crazy in Germany. Moderation is possible, but it's very rare, and it's very rare in America because we have this like, we have like a boner for the First Amendment, which is like fine. I get why we have it there, and it's it's good, but it often gets used in really destructive ways, and we don't really think critically about it a lot. And we see that a lot playing out with these platforms. We have this like allegiance to this idea that the free market will always sort itself out. And what kills me, this is like my my hammer and sickle side coming out, but what kills me is that like I have a ton of progressive friends who have no faith in the free market, but have a ton of faith in the marketplace of ideas, which is bonkers, right? Like the same reason the free market doesn't work, because humans are irrational, we like what's bad for us, we externalize costs on others. That's the same reason the marketplace of ideas doesn't work, because you're given a bunch of options about what article to read, you're gonna read the most inflammatory one. Like our brains are just, we have lizard brains. And so if I get the chance to read, something that's like, bombshell, Trump exposed to be a lizard person from Kenya, I'm gonna read that, because that triggers, it's not just interesting, it also triggers all my tribal impulses about like, I knew it, I was right, they were wrong, I'm smart, they're dumb. If you posted me an article the next day that was like, fact check, turns out he saw a lizard person from Kenya, I'm gonna be like, okay, I'm not gonna click that right now. Like that sounds boring, I don't wanna read that stuff. And that's true for all of us, that's not just me. There's some research that like, conservatives are worse about this, but again, that's just me. Maybe I just believe that research because it sounds good to me and it triggers my tribal impulses, but yeah, this idea that like the answer to everything is more speech, it's just not true. And I think, the one thing I'm grateful for is that like every platform we have now that's on fire is like a perfect argument about that. Like anytime I hear anybody being like, the answer to bad speech is more speech, I'm like, you know how many shares fact checks get on Facebook versus how many shares the lie gets on Facebook? It's like 1,000 to 1 because the human brain likes bad stuff. And so the answer is to regulate it in the same way that we regulate the free market. But people are just like really, when I say that, people look at me like I'm a, like a radical extremist authoritarian. And maybe part of me is, but I think with good reason.
So I'm going to ask you 2 more questions before we wrap up. So the first is that I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about ways that you currently see identity politics playing out in the media or in the current political landscape, and ways that you feel like those conversations about social identity are effective, or ways that you feel like that those debates aren't.
I hate the phrase identity politics. It's not your fault. I understand why it exists. And when I was in college, I was like, I love the phrase identity politics. It's so important to me. But what it's been used for lately is to basically dismiss the stories and voices of marginalized groups as being somehow, different from or separate from real news. It also basically suggests that news written by people who aren't in those marginalized groups has nothing to do with identity, which is also bullshit. Like, anytime you write about yourself or any group, you're using identity politics. It's like when people call food ethnic, I'm like, all food is ethnic, Brenda, because it comes from a certain place with a culture. Like, if you brought a cheeseburger over to India, they'd be like, interesting ethnic food. But almost what always happens is that identity politics is used to dismiss the voices and concerns of marginalized groups. So, if you watch Fox News for like more than a week, you'll hear them talk about identity politics like it's the worst thing in the world. And then immediately afterwards be like, what about white men in America? I'm like, welcome to the club. Welcome to identity politics. So the term is really fraught. We're having a weird moment, both in the sense that as a country, we seem to be growing like really hostile to the idea of identity politics when it comes from black and brown people or like sexual minorities. But we're suddenly very interested in what middle-class white Trump voters have to say about the world and what their anxieties are. And that's been since the election. Maybe there's room for that, but it just kills me that those forms of identity politics are seen as being like important investigative groundbreaking reporting, and stuff about like undocumented immigrants, genuine policy concerns about what's happening to immigrants in this country is seen as being niche. It's not a very helpful term. I do think that journalism should be oriented towards helping marginalized groups, and that stuff is good, and it often gets called identity politics, but all of this stuff is identity politics. Trump ran on like an identity politics campaign about white fright and like anxiety about others. All that stuff is about us versus them, in-group versus out-group. That was like the identity politics campaign. And the truth is that identity politics are not good or bad, just like ethnic food is not good or bad. It's about what the group wants, what their desires are based off of, how much power they have, what their demands mean for other groups who they're competing against. And I think some claims to identity politics are like more legitimate and deserve more attention than others, but it's all identity, Brenda. We all have identities, so we can't talk about this stuff without including our own stories.
So what types of practices do you believe journalism should implement to increase our work around diversity and inclusion?
I'm gonna sound like a broken record about this, and if anyone's done like any journalism stuff, you've probably heard this argument a million times. You probably heard someone who looks like me on a stage being like, we need more non-white journalists a million times. So maybe I'll just say that that's like a given, that we need people in newsrooms who don't look like people who've controlled newsrooms for a long time, and especially editors, because like I know a lot of really good reporters who are black and brown or queer who write dope stories and then have those stories reduced to like skim milk versions of themselves because they have to get them through white editors who don't see those stories as being meaningful. So different looking people in the newsroom. And I think part of that starts with what I mentioned in my speech, which is like, it requires the bravery to be like, we recognize that our journalists have points of view, and we think that those points of view are legitimate and informed by their experiences in a meaningful way. And not that I think we often think of diversity as like a thing that's just nice to have because it sucks if a newsroom is all white. But what you get when you have diversity is like a newsroom that is capable of A, detecting its own blind spots, B, has access to a lot of information that an all white newsroom would not have, and C, is able to articulate what is wrong with the world in a meaningful way based in lived experiences. That's like an incredibly important resource for a newsroom. It is way tougher to talk about what's happening to undocumented immigrants if no one on your staff has any idea what it's like to live in fear of being deported by ICE. Having someone on your staff who does know what that's like will make your reporting a ton better. And I'm really frustrated with news outlets that treat diversity as a thing that's nice to have because it's nice to have diversity. It's good because you are a shitty journalist if you only have one person in your newsroom with one perspective. If you have no access to people's lived experiences, or if you're trying to enter communities that you don't belong to, with people who are suspicious of you, you're gonna be a worse reporter. You're just gonna have a harder time getting into it. I have an easier time talking to people who work for immigration groups because I can be like, Carlos, hello, like I know what this is like. And it seems really small when you're doing it. It seems really minor to be able to reach out to someone and be like, dale, talk to me. And maybe it is really minor in the in the grand scheme of things, but what happens is just that you have reporters who are A, more comfortable talking to those people, and B, those people are more comfortable talking to you. And that's like what journalism is. It's like getting into those communities and asking them what's going on and trying to figure out why it matters. And you can't do that if like your whole editorial board is named John. Like there's just too many Johns. There's too many Johns in this room. You need other people. And yeah, I think part of that comes with owning that perspective is like a part of journalism. It's hard to make the case for diversity if you believe that a journalist can be a blank slate. If you can be totally neutral, why do you need black journalists? I will just figure out the truth about this thing as my white self. So those things are like incompatible. You have to first accept that someone's background and perspective and biases are an important and integral part of what makes journalism what it is, and then be like, ah, crap, we have too many Johns. We can't do these stories right now, and then change your hiring practice accordingly.
So before we wrap up, I'm just going to give a couple of reminders to everybody. So before you head out tonight, we just ask that you please do the single item survey question that we handed out to everybody that asks how well tonight's event helped you understand diversity issues. So there'll be people up at the doors to take those from you. It's really helpful for us to have that feedback. And I also want to invite everybody to consider to join us on May 3rd for our final B.W. Bashan Foundation lecture or diversity lecture series event, which is going to be an executive perspectives on diversity panel that President Dobkin will be moderating with 3 business leaders here in our community in Salt Lake. So with that being said, Carlos, thank you so much for taking the time to come.
I just want to say, thanks guys. Thanks for listening, I really appreciate it. I want to say that I have a tendency when I'm doing these things to seem really confident, like I sit really confident and talk really confident. But the truth is that I'm really insecure about all of these arguments, not in like a therapy way, but like I recognize that I have blind spots too. And if there's something that I've said that seems really off to you, I like welcome you to pull me aside after this and be like, that thing you said was wrong, because that's helpful for me to know as a journalist who's doing this. And yeah, I have my own blind spots. So if anything feels like was really dumb, please don't hesitate to pull me afterwards and tell me. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos.